The next concert given by the Highgate Choral Society consists of 3 contrasting works. We're performing an early piece by Vaughan Williams, The Garden of Proserpine, I always get that wrong, Proserpine, and that's going to be followed by my 3rd symphony, and in the second half, the Mozart Requiem. And you probably know that Mozart was commissioned to write this Requiem. A gentleman came to his door, dressed all in grey, and asked him to write a Requiem. And Mozart, who was quite ill by now, rather thought that he was writing his own Requiem. And the guy was from Count von Walsegg, and Count von Walsegg wanted a Requiem to commemorate the 1st anniversary of the death of his wife, and was probably going to pass off the piece as a piece of his own. But whatever, Mozart was very happy to take the commission. He needed the money. And he started work on the piece, and we have the manuscript, so we know that he finished quite a bit of the first movement, that's almost complete, worked on the next movements, which consist of the Dies Irae sequence, and got to bar 8 of the Lacrimosa, which ironically is the moment when the guilty man meets the judge in heaven, as it were. And at that point, the manuscript stops. And so, and of course, Mozart died is the point. This was December of 1791. And Constanza really needed the piece complete. So she asked pupils of Mozart, would they complete it? And Sussmayer took up the cudgels, and he completed the work. And what we don't know is how much really is by Sussmayer, or how much might have been manuscript papers that we don't have now that Mozart would have suggested what he write. And rather cleverly, whoever thought about doing this, Sussmayer at the very end brings back music from the beginning. And so the fugue, which was the Kyrie eleison at the opening, becomes the Dona Nobis Pacem at the end. And so the Requiem as a whole has a wonderful sense of unity. And there's no way of knowing now when we listen to it which bits are Mozart and which bits are Sussmayer, although I must admit the Hosannas seem to be a rather weak link, and I'm hoping that little bit is not by Mozart himself. But we're going to do that Sussmayer version. Various other people have looked at the manuscript and made their own arrangements, but the Sussmayer is the traditional one, and that's what we will do. And then this first piece, The Garden of Proserpine, I get it right this time, is a very early work by Vaughan Williams. Now, Vaughan Williams, I think, has always been misunderstood. When we see those photographs of him as an old man, and there are plenty of them around because he was in his 80s, and he looks like a lovely, cuddly granddad. And by then, he was a very senior man in the world of music, but in a sense, music had moved on, perhaps. And although 1 or 2 pieces have always been in the repertory, the Tallis Varia Fantasia and the Lark Ascending, and just as a little aside, if the listeners to Classic FM are anything to go by, the Lark Ascending has been voted the most popular classical piece for a dozen years, and so it might suggest that Vaughan Williams is the nation's favourite composer. But apart from these pieces, Serenade to Music is another one on the C Symphony and the 5th Symphony. Apart from those, the rest of the repertoire has been rather neglected, and there's always been this view that Vaughan Williams was a collector of folk songs, he was a collector of hymns and edited the English hymnal, he had lessons with Ravel, he was a late starter. In fact, the Tallis Fantasia and the C Symphony were performed when he was 38 years old, which is really quite late. But until the last 20 years, all of that early music has been unknown. And so the manuscripts have now been brought out, they've been published, and they've been recorded. And so this Garden of Proserpine from 1899, when he was only 27, while he was still studying with Stanford, is a significant 25-minute cantata for soprano, chorus, and very large orchestra, a setting of a poem by Swinburne, which I think if you read it carefully is rather an erotic poem. But what is quite odd is that Vaughan Williams never went back to it, he never revised it, and it was never ever performed. And so these days, because all of this early music is out there, we can reassess his creative life, and there's much more to him than what we thought. He was an organist, didn't really know that. He went to Bayreuth and was heavily influenced by Wagner at the very beginning of his career. But what I love about this piece, The Garden of Proserpine, is that it shows all the hallmarks of what's to come. There are passages that sound like Toward the Unknown Region, which is only a few years away. There are passages that sound like the Sea Symphony. And actually the Garden of Proserpine ends with the chorus singing a repeated A for 2 pages as they express the text. And that very much brings to mind that movement, the last movement of the Sea Symphony, where there's a similar passage of recitative all on one note. And at the very end of the Garden of Proserpine, he brings back a melody which was there at the beginning, which is sort of like a theme for it. And then the piece dies away. And again, we can think of many Vaughan Williams' later pieces where the music dies away. And I think now with the performance in concert halls of all of the symphonies, I mean, they were recorded, but people weren't playing them all, and with the reassessment of his complete works, we really are recognizing what a genius he was. And we're celebrating also the 150th anniversary of his birth, and I was determined to do something that perhaps other choirs were not doing this year. Now, when the lockdown began, I had plenty to do. I was following scores and listening to CDs and doing all sorts of musical things, but I didn't feel like writing. And then I realized after a couple of months that I had Symphony No. 2 waiting to be orchestrated. It was there in sketch form, and I thought, well, I can do that. So I orchestrated Symphony No. 2 over a period of weeks, and suddenly there was something else I wanted to write, and that's Symphony No. 3, which we're going to perform. And that symphony is dedicated to the memory of Naomi Lobenberg, who was a very enthusiastic member of the alto section of the choir, and a great friend and a lovely, lovely person. She did suffer depression, so there were dark times in her life, but she just was a wonderful colleague and a wonderful friend, and I wanted something to remember her by. And what I've realized now I'm looking at the symphony again is that it's really quite a dark work, so it's not a portrait of Naomi at all. And I think what it is, an expression of my grief at her passing. And I knew from the beginning that I wanted these horn calls and really dark, deep chords in the orchestra. And so it begins like that. And then there's a rather mysterious fugal passage that follows, and then this is the first movement, and then quicker music. And those 3 elements come round again, but ending with block chords that build and build to a rather grim climax as the movement ends. Now the second movement is a scherzo and is very light and fluffy, and like a good scherzo has a slow middle section and then a repeat of the A section. The slow movement, the third movement, is melodic. There are some faster passages, and at the end it ends with some wispy music for the violins. I'm not quite sure where that comes from in a way. The violins and the bassoon that sort of play around with semiquavers rather quietly. And then the last movement, which I must remember not to conduct too fast, begins with a chugging movement, energetic movement. And then above that, the strings and various instruments play semiquavers. And that is joyful but not totally happy, I have to confess. And it ends then by bringing back the horn calls, and the horn calls and other parts of the symphony are all built on a tritone, so there is that angst about it. And the horn calls come back with those deep chords, and then the build-up, which had ended movement No. 1, builds up again and ends the symphony on that rather dark note in a way. But I know what I wanted to do. I wanted to write an impressive piece, if I can call it that, in Naomi's memory. So I'm hoping that that's a nice varied concert. You've got Vaughan Williams sounding romantic but still Vaughan Williams-y, and then my dark piece as it mainly is, and then of course the Mozart Requiem, which is just a joy to perform and to listen to. So apart from the